Word learning as the product of multiple cues, factors involved in learning strategy.
Sorry about the long title. Thank you all very much for sticking around for the last talk today. My name's Emma. I'm doing my PhD part-time at the moment. I've just started my third year. My main interest is in language acquisition, first language acquisition, and I'm going to talk to you today about word learning. So, all my research is basically based on this assumption here, that children use many different types of information to learn the meanings of new words. And it's an assumption, but it's a fairly reliable one. This is what everybody's looking at word learning says. There are lots and lots of different ways of doing it. So we know quite a lot about what children can do. We know about some of the types of information they can use. But what we know less about is how learners interpret different types of information. So if you imagine a learner in a natural context, there are lots of different types of information kind of coming at them, lots of different things that they're able to use, and how do they deal with that? How do they make sense of all these different types of information? And how do they interpret them to work out the meaning of a new word in context? So that's what I'm looking at. And importantly then, how does this process of interpretation affect how children learn words? So how does what they do with the input they get then affect how they learn? And my talk today is going to be structured sort of around these 3 points. So I'll start off by talking a little bit about what we already know and about some of the strategies children can use. I'll then move on to talk about an idea I've got for how they might integrate them, how they might interpret them. And then finally I'll talk about an experiment that I'm running which actually sees, looks at what effect this might have on their learning. So the first sort of factor that's relevant to how children learn words is the idea of learner biases. There are just some things in the environment that children react to differently. So children conceptualise the world in different ways, or in specific ways, I should say. They come to the task with these specific conceptual biases that can help them to work out what words mean. So things like they don't interpret this situation as sort of computer and desk. They separate out the individual object and say desk, computer. So that's the type of thing there. And also across the course of word learning, children might learn particular ways of learning words, particularly good heuristics for learning words, which will bias them then to interpret new words in a particular way. But these aren't things that I'm really interested in, because these are things either the speaker generates, that the learner generates, or that the learner is given, and they're not it's not information, it's not cues from the input, and that's what I'm looking at. So one type of information that's sort of available there for the taking is the information that's provided by the environment. So I was saying before, there are just some things in the environment that children find particularly interesting. These include things like animacy, so they're more interested in animate sort of things than inanimate things, and people in particular. Often first words are for people in their lives, this sort of thing. And a study here that I've referenced, they looked at children's word learning in a task called an interesting object, kind of an objectively interesting object, something sort of colourful and shiny and child-friendly, or a boring object, and the children, these were 10 months old, very young learners, went for the interesting object. So something about the nature of the reference available might affect how you learn words. Secondly, particularly early in language development, when you're interacting with young children especially, labels will very often co-occur with their reference. So you'll often be talking about something that's physically present. So the label and its referent will co-occur. And the idea is that across lots of naming episodes, children might learn to use those correspondences to learn new words, and assume that a label refers to an object that it reliably co-occurs with. So these are 2 kinds of environmental cue. Things from the environment that might help children learn what words mean. And again, I'm not going to look at those anymore today, they're just the background. What I'm really interested in is information provided by the speaker. Now, the reason I think this is so important is that words aren't just their meanings. So when children are learning words, they're not just learning sort of a label and a referent and a mapping between them. They're actually learning what we call sort of tools for directing attention. So children, before they learn to speak, they understand about people. They understand about why people do things. They understand that people do things for particular reasons. In the context of words and word learning and language use, they understand that people speak in particular ways in order to sort of create particular outcomes. So when a speaker uses a word, they're trying to direct your attention from where your attention currently is onto their own attention. So I say, look, a lorry, probably that way. I've noticed something, and I want you to notice it too. I want your attention to be shared with mine. And children can do this. Children are really, really good at doing this. And there are really two ways. So one way of learning words, one really good way of learning words, is to work out what speakers are intending those words to mean in that context. So you're not looking for the meaning per se, you're looking for why the speaker's meaning, if you like, rather than the word's meaning. And there are sort of two ways that the speaker can signal their meaning. One is through the use of linguistic cues, so how they choose to present the label linguistically, so what the syntactic context is, and so what sort of structure it occurs in, and also the semantic context, so what words are used around it, the meaning of the surrounding words. And secondly, speakers might use some kind of non-linguistic signaling, so these socio-cognitive gestures. So they might look at or point or handle or otherwise indicate an object or an attribute or an action that's of particular interest to them. So in these situations, there are different things that speakers can do to help children work out what they're referring to. Okay. So I'll give you some examples. In this kind of learning situation, the speaker wants to direct your attention to one display or the other. They can tailor their grammar accordingly. So if they want to direct attention to this object here, use singular syntax, there's the feep, or this display here, there are the feeps. So that's one way in which children can work out what the speaker is trying to draw attention to based on the language she's using. Similarly, in exactly the same situation, she could look at or point to either one of the arrays, and that as well would give an indication of her communicative intent in that situation. So in natural learning situations, there are lots of these types of cue available. Speakers behave in different ways all of the time. There are lots of different types of information a child could potentially use. And in those cases, which I think are most cases, what predicts what cues learners will actually pay attention to? Like, how do you work out what they're actually using? Now, in lots of these sort of learning situations, the cues will be overlapping. You know, it'd be very unusual for someone to be pointing at something and talking about something else entirely. But in that situation, that kind of cue convergent situation, you can't actually tell which cue there the child's using because they're all pointing in the same direction. They could be using a combination of those cues in a sort of additive sort of fashion. They're using them because there are three of them and that's a really good sign, or they could just be relying on one of them and actually the others are kind of immaterial. So I sort of want to look at the factors that are involved in how children work out what cues to use. So if there are lots of cues available, how is it children deal with them? And particularly with linguistic and social information, so information that's coming from the speaker, how do you work out what a speaker is trying to convey in a particular situation? One suggestion is that learners will use these speaker cues more when they form part of a coalition with other cues than when they don't. I'll just explain what I mean. So my idea is that a group of cues acting in concert, acting together, is stronger than a cue in isolation. And this should work both kind of within cue type and across it. So looking and pointing, two types of social cue. If you look and point at something, that should be a stronger cue than if you look at it or if you pointed it on its own. So that's within the cues. And similarly, looking and syntax, so two different types of cue, if they act together, that should provide a stronger cue than either one of those acting in isolation. And I've designed some experiments to look at this. So I can test this claim, this kind of cue strength claim, by comparing children's cue use in two types of learning environment. Firstly, in situations where the amount of referential information these cues provide is varied, so within each cue, so looking versus looking and pointing, different amounts of social information, different amounts of linguistic information. And secondly, in situations where the cues either support each other, so in situations of cue convergence, and in situations of cue divergence. And I hope that by looking at these, I'll be able to see whether the amount of information provided with the strength of the cue affects how children use those cues. So here, and this is the type of setup I'm going to use, so I showed you these slides earlier. In this situation, two different ways of signalling your communicative intent, either using the grammatical number or using socio-cognitive gesturing. So these are the two cues that I'm going to be looking at. And the reason I've chosen these and this type of learning environment is because these cues can be combined to create either convergent learning situations or divergent conditions here. So through the table quickly. We've got the social cognitive cues here, so either gesturing to the individual or gesturing to the group, and the morphosyntactic cues here, so plural number marking versus singular number marking. So if you take the gesture to the individual combined with the singular number marking, the cues are in alignment, right? So you point to an individual object, there's the feep, a feep, that works. They both converge in the same interpretation. The same way, if you gesture to the group, while pointing to the group, you've got the convergence. But also you can do the opposites here. You can create divergent situations by pointing to the individual and using plural syntax, or pointing to the group and using singular syntax. So I want to compare learning in these two conditions versus these two conditions. And also, with both of our cues, the internal strength, if you like, the amount of information within each cue, can also be varied. So if you see here, right at the top, look, I see the feep, and look, I see the feeps. There's just one piece of number information here, numbers just marked on the noun. The second row, the number information is marked on the verb and the noun, in both conditions. And the third condition is marked on the noun, the determiner, and the verb. And so we've got one piece of information versus two versus three. And I'm just going to look at the first two of those, and I'll be referring to them as MS1 and MS2, so one piece of information versus two. Similarly, you can vary the strength of the social cue, so you can have looking, pointing, and looking and pointing. And in keeping with before, I'm just going to look at these two for the time being, one piece of social information versus two, SC1 and SC2. So I designed an experiment to compare children's use of grammatical number when it occurs in a coalition of cues versus when it occurs in isolation. So when it occurs with other cues of the same type, either one or two, and when it occurs with cues of a different type, either in alignment or in a divergent situation. I've got 32 children, well, I hope to find 32 children to take part, all between 36 and 42 months, and that's 3 and 3.5 years old. I selected that age range because even though children younger than this are sensitive to number information, this is the youngest group who have been successfully using sort of experiments like this one and to use it referentially. So this is the youngest group I think I can reasonably test at this point. And they'll all be monolingual English speakers because I think the linguistic background of the child might have an effect in this kind of situation. Some material for it. Okay, I've got so the audio stimuli, 24 sentences, each containing a novel label, and they're created by attaching these novel noun phrases with one of 3 different carriers, so they're all consistent. And what you'll notice here is that where the sentences are spliced in the middle, that's the onset of the number information. So the noun phrase containing the number information, and the number information starts here, or it starts here. All spoken by a female native speaker of Southern British Standard English using child-directed speech. You'll have some examples in a minute. And the visual stimuli are 24 objects, each one matches one of the novel labels, and that's varied. So the 24 novel objects, these are all things that I hope children won't have existing labels for. If you spot any that you think they might, please let me know. And also pictures of 4 known objects, which we expect children of this age to be able to label. Can you see those okay? And both the sentences and the images are embedded in these videos. This is just a picture from one. They're 18 seconds long, and the location of the target is counterbalanced across all the trials. And as you'll see in a few minutes, the speaker actually starts off facing the camera and then turns, and the direction she turns in is balanced as well. It's got 2 independent variables. The type of morphosyntax used, and that's at 2 levels, MS1 and MS2, one piece of information versus 2, and that's varied within subjects, so all children will experience both levels. And the type of trial as well, whether it's a convergent trial or a divergent trial, so whether the syntax converges or diverges with the social cue. And that's varied across subjects. There will be 16 children in the convergent condition and 16 in the divergent. So I'm just going to show you an example of the convergent trial. And you'll see that she uses singular syntax and a singular cue, so she points to the individual while using singular syntax. The syntax is at the first level, just one piece of information, and the cues collide.
Let's see. Look, I see the feep. Feep.
So there's a bit of a problem with the fact that she's speaking when she's not actually speaking. I'm going to fix that. And I was going to take this trial. Oh, you'll notice that when she started pointing, when she started looking, the start of the look was aligned with the start of the number information. So they both started at the same point, and she starts turning at that point, and then she finishes turning. She's completed the turn by the time the repetition of the label finishes. So you hear, to be like, look, I see the glaives, and then she. No, that's not quite right. I'm going to show you another one so we can see. So this is a divergent trial. In this case, she uses the plural syntax at the second level this time, so there are the washes, two pieces of information, and again she looks at the singular display.
Let's see. Look. There are the washes. Washes.
So yeah, by the time the second label's been repeated, she's already facing back towards the camera. And I did get her permission to show you all these videos, just in case anybody's concerned. Okay, so the experiments, they take place in Elfland, in the Edinburgh Laboratory for Language Development, over in the Appleton Tower. And this is a sort of stylised version of what they see. It's a preferential looking study, so the child is sitting on a parent's lap sort of in front of the screen, and there's a camera recording their eye movements, which we then code offline afterwards. The predictions are that participants will pay more attention to grammatical number in the convergent condition than the divergent condition, and that's regardless of the syntax type. And similarly, the participants will pay more attention to grammatical number when it provides more information than when it provides less, regardless of the trial type. And I hope, if it all goes well, to be able to conclude from that the presence of cue coalitions affects children's word learning, such that learners show a greater tendency to use the number information if it's supported by cues than if it's contradicted by them, and also when it provides more referential information, so that cue strength affects cue use. Very quickly, I'll just talk to you what I plan to do next. So my immediate plans for this experiment being finished are to run another very similar one, which will use exactly the same design, except that instead of varying the strength of the morphosyntax, I'll vary the strength of the social cue. So I'll look at looking versus looking and pointing. I'll use video just like the ones before, except that just rather than just looking, she'll look and point, and the syntax will be held consistent. There'll be convergent and divergent trials, just like before. So once I've had a look at that, once I've thought about and got some information about how cue strength affects children's use of these particular cues, I want to look at what other factors might be relevant. One is the age of the learner. So it's argued that across development, learners actually learn which cues are most reliable, and they follow reliable cues more than less reliable cues. So they learn how to learn words. And I wonder then if this means that the role of grammatical cues might increase across development relative to social cues. So that could be tested by using the same methodology, particularly the convergent and the divergent distinction, and just doing the same thing but with older learners and seeing if they behave in the same way as the 3-year-olds already tested. Secondly, I think the linguistic background of the learner might be relevant, as mentioned before. Particularly, social cues are consistent across languages, relatively, whereas grammatical cues, kind of by definition, vary. So I wonder then if bilingual children might pay relatively more attention to social cues and less attention to grammatical cues than monolingual children. And that could be tested by performing exactly the same kind of study with a group of bilingual learners and comparing them to what would essentially then be a monolingual kind of baseline. And finally, I think the type of word a learner is acquiring might be relevant. So we know that social cues can be used to learn nouns and verbs, and so can syntactic cues. But it's very often claimed that social cues are more relevant to the acquisition of nouns and verbs, so they're more useful in that context. And likewise, that syntactic cues are more useful for learning verbs than they are for learning nouns. And if that's the case, then we might find a difference in this kind of setup. So I could run the same experiments, but look at verb learning and see whether children's use of social and linguistic information is the same when they're learning verbs as when they're learning nouns. So what I hope is that I've got sort of a methodology here that can be used to explore all sorts of different factors that might affect how children learn words in context. Thank you very much.
So you have time for questions?
Oh.
All right, take your questions.
I don't think that, maybe I missed it. How are you measuring how strong each factor is?
Yeah, no, I didn't go
Okay.
with that. You didn't miss anything. No, so I'm looking at the dependent measure here will be the difference in time spent looking at the objects in the baseline and in the test phase. And the baseline is defined as the time before the cue, and the test phase is after. And that's why it was important that the cues are in alignment. So from the beginning of the social and linguistic cue versus afterwards. And that should go some way as well to sort of controlling for what they prefer, looking at the individual or groups. They might just want those, might just be more interesting, so I don't know why it's doing that. Yeah?
And sort of related to that, I guess all the way through I was expecting a fairly slightly different experiment, right? So I was surprised when you had the same objects in the two pictures. So I was expecting you were going to say, well, we'd have, a feep in one and 10 glins in the other.
Yeah.
And then we test them afterwards whether they what meaning they associated with the word.
Yeah.
So how sure are you that what they're actually doing here is really word learning rather than attending to a situation or something?
Yeah. Nice. So in the original version of it, I did have exactly the same setup. The setup that you described with a single object of one kind and a group of objects of a different kind. And there were a few reasons for changing that. One was to do with perceptual saliency, just because that's such a big issue that it was very hard to find objects that were equally interesting and equally sized and equally kind of colourful and all these things. So this goes some way to just making sure that the referents are objectively equally interesting, coupled with the sort of the baseline comparison. Another reason for doing that was that I didn't want to. No, I'll tell you about that in a second. So, I can't remember what was the second part of your question?
Well, I was just worried whether the task. How convinced you are that this task is learning the label versus somehow just immediately attending to the right kind of things.
Yeah, and I think it's a bit of both. I think the reason I think it's really relevant to word learning and it has to do with word learning is because a big part of word learning is actually working out what particular thing the speaker's attending to, and I think that's the part of word learning that it really taps into. So it's not. So in that situation, we know what a feep is because there's only one possible thing a feep could be in that situation. But I'm not convinced that that's a problem because saying, okay, how is the speaker using feep in this situation? What's she trying to make me look at by using feep in this way, in this context? And I think that's actually quite a fair reflection of how word learning works. But it is definitely it's a strange design in that way. I think that's.
Sorry, it's a bit greedy, but that's a great answer. It's an excellent answer. I think that's right. So, but what I'd love to see then is a follow-up at the end of the experiment to see whether there is actually a difference in the recall of those words depending on conversions versus divergence. Because if you're right, which I think you probably are, that is important, then the question is whether the kind of how convinced they are that they're looking at the right thing might have a kind of a longer term effect.
Yeah, so whether or not it's if they use the social information, whether that sort of created a more, but they were more reliable.
You're sort of in rational terms, you should be like more convinced that that's actually you did learn the right thing.
Yes. Yeah. No, that's great.
What do you think about sort of the use of multiple cues being applied to other types of acquisition, such as reading? Because at the moment in reading, there's a huge thing about synthetic phonics should be the only thing used, and multiple cues should be eliminated. Do you think that it can be cross-acquisition?
I don't know anything about how it relates to reading. I do know some studies have been done with sort of like these are kind of cross-modality in learning tasks. And so if you hear, if you have audio information and vision information, you learn better than if you're learning just from one modality. So I think that might be sort of relevant. And my kind of thinking at this point is that more cues are better. I think
Yeah.
the more information you have available, when they're in alignment, I think that's the best learning situation. When they're confusing, I think that's a different question. You have to work out, well, how do you work out which is best and what determines what's best in that situation. But I think something like reading, as long as the systems aren't conflicting, I think then the more information the better. That would be my guess.
Just a small note, but similar. I wasn't sure to address it, but Aborsh in your picture, it also had 4 wheels. And
Yeah, I'll just go
Feet
back to
also
that.
had lots of nodes.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
they wouldn't actually be incongruent, but you would just learn that the wheels are the washes.
That's right, and that's what I was trying to say. Thank you, because that's what I was trying to say in answer to the earlier question. That's part of the reason for using the same stimuli, the same type of object in each picture, is because if you were trying to sort of draw attention to plurality, when you've got such a good example of plurality here, and such a kind of bad example, a worse example of plurality, with a group of objects versus with an individual object. We hope that by using the same objects, the potential plurality in the individual object will be less salient.
I had a sort of related question and then a suggestion. So how ambiguous are the syntactic cues for kids at this age? So if it was an adult and you get the singular form when they're looking at the plural C, you might reconcile it. I say, well, that's just like a feet is like a term for a collection of these crazy
Yeah.
things. Or
Yeah.
would 3-year-old kids do that? Or
I'm not sure. I think if it turns out that in the divergent condition they're following the grammatical cues, that's the whole thing I haven't spoken about actually. In that condition, which they're going to go for, and that's because I don't know and I'm really interested to find out, and that's partly why I'm doing the experiments. And if it turns out that children of this age they do go for the grammatical cue, which would be interesting because they've really only just learned how to at this age, I would then spend some more time looking into what they think it means. So if they for an individual image, if they assume that the plural refers to that, how will they interpret it? And actually try to follow up to see actually, well, what did you think the word meant then in that situation? And the same with the social cue actually.
And then the kind of follow up was another thing that you might get individual differences in which two people attend it.
Yeah.
So kids who are good at social stuff might over rely on the social cues, and kids who are bad at following social cues might rely more on the grammatical.
Yeah, I did a study a little while for my masters that looked at monolingual and bilingual children and how they use social cues and mutual exclusivity. And it turned out that the bilingual children who at that age were more sort of socially advanced, they went with the social cue, and the monolingual children went for the lexical cue for mutual exclusivity. So, and you had these two distinct populations of learners. But actually even within the monolingual group, you still had a whole group who just, well, not a large group, but enough of the children who consistently use the cue that made me think actually it wasn't in that case to do with language, it was actually to do with some kind of underlying cognitive difference at that stage to create a different population of learners.
Is there an equivalent of the autism quotient questionnaire for 3-year-olds? I guess.
Ah! I should find out.
Yeah, it's called ASRS. It's